Jak and Daxter, despite its laid-back demeanor, houses some of the most abstract and difficult tricks hidden in its any % speedruns. And without prior context, it would be impossible to understand what's going on by watching the world record, let alone fully grasp just how impressive it is to finish a single run in the category. Before we dive into that though, first some shoutouts. This run was performed by the Stellar, whose YouTube and Twitch channels are linked in the description below, along with the Discord link to the community if you find yourself inspired to learn the game. Just please don't start out with this category. Second, this video's production was helped along significantly by Stellar and Barg034, who looked over the script and fact-checked my work, as well as the creators and contributors of the Open Goal project, which is a fan-made decompilation and PC port for the original Jak trilogy that allowed for the ability to look through the game's code to confirm exactly how it works. You can find all their links in the description below. Finally, this video was made possible by the members of this channel, my patrons, my Twitch subscribers, and this channel's partner NordVPN. We'll hear more about them at the end, but for now, thank you for watching. Before Jak even makes it out of the portal, we need to talk about a concept that will be present throughout the run: spacing. This term refers to the player's position in 3D space, and where your next movement option will take you. Let's use Jak's two main moves to illustrate this: punching and roll jumping. As you can see, these will take us to different final positions at differing speeds. If you have a keen eye, you may have noticed that punching is faster than roll jumping, and could safely assume that this would be the main form of movement. And you would be half correct. If it wasn't for the short cooldown period between the end of punches, they alone would be the fastest method to traverse flat ground. To work around this, we can roll jump during that period instead, and essentially chain these two moves together. This will also, in turn, affect our spacing, as 2 roll jumps alone will take us into a completely different spot than a punch, roll jump, and punch, or just 2 punches. Another aspect of this is that you can punch at various distances depending on how long you hold down the square button, as well as the fact that the roll jump sends you upward slightly, which you can use to make it over small inclines while staying at speed. These minor differences in spacing and how the runner implements them in their route can save seconds throughout the game, and are the difference between high-level runs. They will also play a major part in how some of the tricks we will see later on are going to shake out. One final thing to mention is that this run was done on the PlayStation 2 version of the game, as that has historically been the one with the most competition due to a variety of factors that I won't go over here. With that out of the way, let's get into the run. You might remember the long intro cutscene with opening narration by Samos whenever you make a new file. This, and every other cutscene in the game, is unskippable by design, so runners opt to start from a file that is already inside Geyser Rock. To reset his previous attempt, Stellar loads this anchor file at the bottom, which is a term used for a save file reserved only for the purposes of starting a new run. Once loaded, he pauses to save to a new file slot, and the timer begins once he first touches the ground and gains control of Jak. One quick thing to note about Stellar's input display is that whenever he starts a roll, you can see him quickly tap both L1 and R1. Both of these buttons will initiate a roll when Jak is running forward, and Stellar doubles his inputs this way to try and avoid a somewhat rare instance where Jak will crouch briefly instead of performing a roll. Once out of the portal, he starts punching and roll jumping towards our first power cell, which are the game's main collectible. To activate the portal back to Sandover Village and leave this tutorial, we need to collect all 4 of these power cells scattered throughout the level. Upon collecting one of these power cells, a short cutscene will play. There are a few different ones depending on the power cell, and these are tied to the power cell's actor being loaded. All level actors, for example the orbs, crates, training dummies, and cells in Geyser, load and deload based on the camera, and whether or not it is inside predetermined level bounds. These bounds consist of various trees that break up a level into chunks, and each actor has data that assigns them to one of these trees. We can abuse this to skip the collection cutscene for the first power cell, but to do so, we need to get the camera into a high enough position to end up outside of the tree assigned to it. Luckily, these rocks that serve as the walls of the level are able to be climbed thanks to this training dummy. This specific type of raised dummy in the level is coded to break only while Jak has the jump state flag and he isn't considered grounded. When we hit it with a roll jump spaced like so, instead of breaking, it will react by entering this shaking animation, where it is briefly unable to be broken. As Stellar lands on the ground after the roll jump, he quickly presses X, which lets him high jump without the long startup animation if timed correctly. Once high enough from this jump, he initiates a ground pound onto the top of the dummy and holds X during it to get another high jump. He then spins at the apex of this jump to get enough height to make it on top of these rocks. In the Jak trilogy, there are three main types of collision. Ground, represented here by red, which is most of what you interact with in normal gameplay. Obstacle, which for the most part acts the same as ground, shown here in purple. And finally, wall collision, shown here in blue. Jak cannot normally stand on this type of wall collision, and when he is in contact with it while having any form of momentum, he will enter his crouching animation and be unable to perform any actions other than influence the direction he is currently moving in. This is internally called the target slide down state, and it can be avoided by either counteracting any current forces by holding the opposite direction on the control stick, or on flat collision like here in Geyser, simply not touching the stick, which runners usually call going neutral or holding neutral. While at a complete standstill on this wall collision, Jak will stand up in his default target stance state, and he can act as if he was normally grounded for the most part, though attempting to walk in any direction would introduce momentum back into the equation and put him back in his sliding state. Back over to Stellar, once he's at the apex of his jump and spinning, he moves over to land on the rocks and starts holding neutral, so he can briefly enter the target stance state. Once he's in that state, he taps X to jump off the wall collision and moves over towards this rock, which is considered obstacle collision, allowing him to walk like normal. Once on the rock, he walks back towards the cell, double jumps, and ground pounds down once he's over the top of it. Then he starts moving his camera to the left. The ground pound will take him down to the cell fast enough to collect it and very briefly begin the collection animation right before the cell has fully deloaded. A few frames later, the cell deloads and the game no longer has the data required to continue playing the cell animation, so it ends it prematurely and puts Stellar back into normal gameplay, while still getting the game to recognize that he has collected the cell, indicated here by the autosave and the autosave explanation prompt that pops up as he moves on to collect the next cell. This one is locked behind these 7 collectibles in these red boxes called scout flies, which are usually broken by either ground pounding them or uppercutting them. Stellar is instead going to head further into the level to grab this pair of 2 small blue eco clusters. When these are collected, they add a small amount of time to this gauge at the bottom right that indicates which type of eco Jak is currently channeling. While channeling blue eco, Jak will move a good bit faster while running and while he's in the air, activate certain pieces of nearby precursor technology, and most importantly, pull in nearby collectibles like a magnet. This ability also works on collectibles inside wooden crates, and the red crates that hold scout flies, which break upon getting into range. One small thing to note about scout flies in general is that the power cell rewarded upon collecting the 7th can spawn at any scout fly location to account for differing player exploration. Some of these cells will be assigned differing collection animations which vary in length. This minor difference is accounted for in the standard geyser route that Stellar is performing. The cell that spawns from the last fly he collects gives this dunking animation, the fastest of the bunch, which is why he collects them in this seemingly backwards order. Once the second cell animation is finished, he heads back towards where these eco clusters will respawn once his gauge replenishes, and he recollects them. He needs to be channeling this blue eco for the 3rd power cell, which is locked behind a precursor door that opens for Jak while he's channeling blue eco. He spaces his next bit of movement so he can roll jump, high jump, and spin on top of this rock, and then start a roll jump chain over these small ledges to make it to the cell. Once it's finished collecting, he moves backwards slightly, just enough to fit in a roll jump and avoid landing in the water, taking a tighter line than landing down on the pontoons. Now all that's left is a chain of movement to optimize the line to the 4th and final cell of Geyser Rock. With it collected, he just needs to go back to turn on the portal and exit the level. To get there as fast as possible, he uppercuts and ground pounds straight down, intentionally taking fall damage. This would be slower, but the fall damage animation that we call splatting can be instantly cancelled by quickly double tapping triangle to enter and exit first person mode. He's able to do this because the fall damage animation still gives you the allow look around flag. This oversight was later fixed in the sequels though. Once he hits the button and enters the portal, a 50-second long cutscene plays with Samos assigning us some busy work over in Sentinel Beach, which in true teenage fashion we are going to promptly ignore. While he keeps yapping, let's quickly go over why this run is so short. The world of Jak and Daxter is structured into 3 main hubs, with different levels branching out from each. These hubs are traversed between via these connector levels, driven through on the Zoomer vehicle invented by Samos's daughter, Kira. Each of these connector levels has an in-lore obstacle that blocks you from progressing through them until you collect enough power cells. The requirements for these are as follows: 20 cells to power the Zoomer's heat shield to pass through Fire Canyon, 45 cells to power the Blue Sage's machine to move this boulder leading to Mountain Pass, and finally 72 cells to boost the Zoomer's heat shield enough to withstand the burning hot temperatures of Lava Tube. Over the years, talented glitch hunters in the community have found methods to skip each one of these requirements, making this straight shot route to Citadel possible, cutting the run down to just 8 power cells. If you want to know the details of how this all went down, check out Ricky's video on the subject here and in the description below. Back to the run, it looks like Samos is finally done talking, so Stellar can now beeline it straight towards Fire Canyon. Once he's in the level, he saves and loads the game. This is required for Fire Canyon skip. Whenever Jak is touching the ground, the game updates his last known safe ground position. But if we jump as soon as possible after respawning, we can avoid this position from being updated from the game world origin of 000, which is the default that gets set during the reload. The window for pressing X before this is updated is, in practice, 3 frames, thanks to a tiny amount of buffer the game allows for. After the reload, this period occurs while the game is still displaying a black screen to hide the level assets loading in. So Stellar hits X before Jak is even visible to us. Any % runners have to get a feel for this load time to consistently start the skip. He needs to chain a few more of these 3-frame jumps until he makes it far enough out over the hot ground of the canyon. This hot ground's collision has an event tied to it called Burn Up. Whenever Jak touches this collision on foot, the game hits him with an attack called Target Attack Up. During this attack, the game attempts to bounce him back towards solid ground by doing a check on a 20 by 20 by 15 meter cube around Jak. This might sound big, but meters in this world are actually quite small. Jak himself is roughly 3 meters tall despite not looking very tall. We'll go into the specifics of this check in a moment, but for the start of this trick to work, all we need to know is that Stellar needs to be far enough into the canyon when he gets hit for any valid collision to be outside of this box. When it fails to find a valid position, it attempts to fall back to the last known safe ground. If this position is outside of a 10-meter range vertically, it will instead just send Jak straight up into the air. Because our last known safe ground will still be the default position at 000, and our current height in Fire Canyon is 31 meters high, we fail both checks and get sent straight up. When taking damage from this attack, Jak is only able to enter his death animation once he's considered grounded. But because we continuously hit another burn-up surface without a stored ground point, Jak will be able to infinitely bounce despite the fact that we have no more hit points. And during this, we can actually influence his direction and start traveling through Fire Canyon. Because there are no checkpoints aside from the start and the end, Stellar now has to make it all the way through to change his checkpoint before he dies, to avoid respawning at the beginning. After successfully starting Fire Canyon skip, before he fully runs out of health, Stellar quickly stands on this piece of collision to turn around before he loses all his HP. Because this strange bit of ground collision doesn't end up updating our last known safe ground position, we can continue the infinite bounces through Fire Canyon after this turnaround. This turnaround seems needless at first glance, but actually plays a significant role in making the trick possible. The first notable benefit is that we get back to full speed a few frames faster than if we were facing forward, and the second benefit will come into play momentarily. During this travel through Fire Canyon, there are various hazards Stellar needs to avoid, such as some gaps in the collision or edges of the collision that will cause Jak to become briefly grounded and enter his dying animation. But the main threats are the crates and ramps scattered throughout the level. This is where the initial cube check at the start of the Target Attack Up event comes into play. This check is internally called Find Ground Point, and is referred to by runners as the Spider, a term coined by Stellar himself, which will make a bit more sense after seeing this visualizer originally made by Water111, who also wrote a document about how this check works, which I referenced heavily for this section. This visual that Water created was later iterated and added to the Speedrun practice mod by Barg034. Inside of this cube, the game is checking 8 different directions around Jak, probing for valid collision to pull him towards, which is represented here by the lines emanating out from Jak. One thing you may immediately notice about this visual is that there are only 7 lines. This is presumably a bug, as the forward direction gets checked twice. What counts as forward though depends on Jak's current velocity. While Jak's velocity is over 0.1 meters per second, forward is in the direction that Jak is currently moving. But below that threshold, forward is considered whatever direction Jak is currently facing. Both of these factors combined are crucial to understand when attempting Fire Canyon Skip, and are part of what makes the trick possible. During the travel through the canyon, Stellar has to keep a far enough distance away from the boxes and ramps throughout the level so he doesn't get pulled in, get considered grounded when landing on the top, and then die. Most of the ramps and boxes aren't too hard to avoid, and just involve keeping your distance. But there are some major exceptions I'm going to refer to as the Great Filters. First box, second box, ramp, and these dark eco crates. Most Fire Canyon Skip attempts will never make it past the first box, let alone all the way through each and every filter to the end of the level. These chained together are the reason only a handful of people have ever finished an any % run. Stellar's mastery of this segment is part of the reason you would never guess how difficult it truly is. He absolutely flies through this segment, taking very optimized lines that just barely keep obstacles outside of the spider's range. Once he closes in on the first box, he intentionally breaks his optimal line and bounces into this corner. This bit of movement will normalize his spacing, so the next set of inputs are consistent regardless of how the start played out. From this position, he has practiced exactly where he needs to bounce on the very edge of this land bridge's collision, with his current velocity influencing where the 7 lines point as he lands to keep the box out of view of the spider. This collision is slightly mismatched to the visuals of the level, which adds to its difficulty, giving you less cues to utilize. Since we are watching a world record attempt, obviously Stellar manages to make it past the first box and continues on to the next great filter. On the way towards the second box, he slides over this precursor metal, which is considered wall collision, letting him pass over it safely. This is slightly faster than going around it, and it also serves the same purpose as the corner at first box earlier, normalizing his movement for this section. Only this time, it makes the trick slightly harder rather than easier. The same idea as the first box applies to the second box, bouncing along the very edge of the collision and slipping past. This next filter, the ramp, is where things get a bit more complicated. Because this section is so narrow, we can't just simply hug the wall and squeeze past. This is where changing Jak's facing direction finally comes into play. As he's attempting to bypass the ramp, Stellar has to nudge Jak along the wall to land in a specific spot and go neutral on the stick, making sure Jak's velocity is under that 0.1 meters per second threshold before he lands, so the spider will orient itself into the direction Jak is facing, positioning that gap with the missing leg behind him, making the ramp just out of range of the spider once he hits the ground again. Then following that up by moving right as he starts bouncing to land in another specific spot, adjusting his velocity by holding back briefly before going neutral again on the stick. And then finally, after that bounce, he starts moving to land far enough away over this tiny slope. Any deviation in this chain of bounces and it's run over. And he's not out of the woods just yet. Up ahead is the final major obstacle. There's no way to completely avoid this cluster of dark eco crates, but because they explode on contact, unlike the previous crates, we can remove them before continuing on, as long as we hit them from the side without landing on the top, which would count as ground and play Jak's death animation once we land on him. During this, you also have to keep the lurkers in mind, which can rarely get in the way and bounce you back. On top of this, you can also potentially get a standpoint on top of a lurker and instantly die. The remaining obstacles aren't major barriers, as there's enough room to safely maneuver around them, but if you aren't careful, you can land on the edge of this collision and die, and obviously the final 2 crates can still potentially pull you in if your spacing is wrong. Before Stellar makes it to the other side and dies, he moves his camera towards the cell to make sure it hits the trigger, which will give him the ending checkpoint. To finish out the skip, he grabs the cell at the end of the level to remove an invisible barrier that would block his path forward. And for future reference, these barriers exist at the end of each connector level. Now that he's in Rock Village, he's going to head straight towards Mountain Pass. But on the way, he also needs to grab these green eco pills out of these breakable barrels for an upcoming skip. Once he breaks the first set of crates and grabs the eco, he hops up on top of the railing to perform our first boosted uppercut of the run. usually referred to as a boosted for short. This refers to a piece of tech that will give you extra distance and speed out of an uppercut by performing one while slowly walking off a ledge. The edges of ledges have less friction than flat ground, which we can take advantage of via the slow walk combined with the game's short amount of coyote time, which is a general platformer term that refers to a buffer period where you're technically no longer on a platform, but the game still allows you to briefly act as if you were. These properties of ledges combined will net you more horizontal momentum than intended, by amplifying the initial momentum from the punch, letting you cross over larger gaps than normal. Here in Rock Village, it's used as a very minor bit of time save to get to another set of barrels faster, but it will be a vital piece of tech for the upcoming skips. Before breaking the third set of barrels, he slowly walks up to them, which is a bit counterintuitive, because the game is keeping track of every eco pill it spawns. This will cause the game to only spawn 1 out of a barrel if the count goes over 10, and it will spawn none if the count is over 20. This counter only ticks down after a pill is deactivated after being picked up, or if it despawns on its own naturally. When a pill is collected, it doesn't instantly deactivate though, and instead follows Jak briefly with a particle effect, and lingers for a bit after that. So this brief walk gives the previously collected eco enough time to fully despawn and decrease that counter before breaking the next set of crates, so Stellar can get the maximum yield, as he needs at least 28 green eco before continuing. After collecting this last set, he starts heading over to the entrance of Mountain Pass. During this brief swim over, he utilizes a piece of tech called fast swimming. Jak's swimming animation starts out with an initial burst of speed and tapers off near the end, repeating as long as you hold the stick forward. But if you instead tap the stick forward in a rhythm, you can reset the animation back to that initial burst over and over and over, making Jak swim significantly faster than intended and easily outpace the Lurker shark, which lets us skip talking to and paying the warrior to move the pontoons back into a bridge formation for us. Once across, he makes his way up to the boulder that blocks the path forward and performs an uppercut off the side of the platform. Stellar positions himself into this corner, which, like the collision in Geyser, is considered wall collision, so touching it with any momentum will cause Jak to enter his sliding state and slip down into the water below. Because this collision is sloped, instead of holding neutral, he has to counteract the gravity by holding his stick into the wall. Doing so will make Jak enter his target stance state, which will allow Stellar to jump up and grab the ledge, successfully skipping the 45 cell requirement to enter Mountain Pass, where he can now start the Claw boss fight. Once the opening cutscene for the fight is finished, he performs a boosted uppercut over to the rightmost rock, and then lines up a roll jump to land on a piece of the precursor bridge that is sticking up out of the lava. This bridge is normally used to make your way over to this yellow eco and hit Claw at the end of each of his phases. Now that he's standing on this piece of the bridge, he starts slowly walking along the edge of its collision to get another boosted uppercut to another set of bridge pieces, and then uppercuts on them over to the platform where you would normally shoot Claw with yellow eco, skipping the wait during his first phase for him to shoot all of his boulders out and spawn the blue eco that you normally use to activate the bridge. Once he's on this platform, he quickly enters and exits first person mode to orient himself for this next trick, due to, as Stellar puts it, because of Claw's big fat ass in the way of the camera. Once he gets a general idea of where he is, he starts moving towards this hot rock sticking out of the lava to perform a trick called Lava Walk. For a world record attempt, this trick needs to be successful on the first try, which makes it another of the great filters for completing high-level runs. This hot rock will damage Jak with a burn event when he touches it, and the lava beneath it will instantly kill him if touched. But if you line up correctly and the stars align in your favor, Jak will grab the side of the rock and interrupt the burn damage, leaving him with the state flag that's supposed to be taken away after the damage animation is finished. This flag is called the Being Attacked flag, and while it is applied to Jak, it makes him immune to any damage event until it is removed, including the insta-kill lava below him, letting Stellar simply walk across it past Claw and enter the next section of the level without finishing the fight. With this trick hit first try, Stellar remains at the same health value he had before attempting it, which is crucial for the last major skip of the run. Any movement options here other than walking would reset his state flags and cause him to die, so Stellar is required to walk through the lava without punching or roll jumping until he makes it to the other side. The being attacked state flag only clears at the end of the first jump animation, and by that time, he is already above the lava, so he can safely pull himself up and start the Mountain Pass Lurker race. Because Claw is still loaded and we never finished his fight after starting the race, our camera's point of interest is still set to Claw, which makes it behave very erratically, and this behavior is lovingly nicknamed Drunk Cam. This point of interest will still remain where Claw was, even when he is deloaded during the race. So high-level runners have practiced this segment with this camera a ton, and are able to understand roughly how it will move and adjust themselves through the level accordingly. During this race, Stellar needs to grab Blue Eco, which will give him a short burst of speed on the zoomer, as well as increase its maximum speed up to a cap. Eco vents increase the counter by 2, and the smaller clusters increase it by 1, up to a maximum of about 7. And most importantly, he also needs to collect the last needed green Eco pills out of the wooden crates in the level. Once you collect 50 of these green Eco pills, they act as an extra reserve hit, allowing you to take 3 damage before dying, which, as mentioned previously, is needed for the last major connector level skip. On top of all that, Mountain Pass is littered with these bombs that would instantly kill him if hit, so just a moment of getting off track or not reacting to the camera changing correctly could spell the end of the run. Once he's near the end of the level, Stellar has to slow down, otherwise he would fail the race due to the slightly lazy way it's coded. While the race is active, the game is doing a simple distance check between Jak and the Lurkers, which in practice we can visualize with a big sphere. If Jak goes anywhere outside of this sphere, regardless of whether or not he's technically ahead of the Lurkers in the race, the failure cutscene will play and you'll be sent back to the beginning. To slow down, Stellar holds both square and X at the same time, which allows him to still maintain his blue eco charges, as they only disperse if you slow down to a certain speed or let go of X for any amount of time. Once Stellar knows he's waited long enough, he jets forward to kill the Lurker in charge of the detonator, and then collects the last of the required green eco before finally grabbing the cell to remove the invisible barrier from Mountain Pass and to get off the zoomer. Once he's off the zoomer, Stellar first double taps triangle to quickly reset his camera's point of interest back to normal. Now that Claw is no longer loaded, he won't hijack our camera and make himself the point of interest after exiting first person mode. Now he needs to head over to the entrance of Lava Tube with some death-defying spacing past the Red Sage's hut, into a boosted uppercut chain on the railing over towards these craters, onto the pillar next to the fly, and finally over to this railing. The planks on these rails are coded as floor on all sides, which can lead to some interesting interactions. But the main one we care about here is the rocket uppercut. By interrupting Jak's uppercut animation by colliding with the side of a plank, which will put him in his grounded state, Jak will maintain that initial burst of momentum for longer than intended, if spaced correctly. At the apex of this vertical launch, we can enter first person mode, as its only requirement is being in the grounded state. When exiting first person mode, Stellar uppercuts and spins over the invisible wall surrounding the level, landing on these decorative rock pillars, which are considered obstacle collision, which allows him to stand on them as normal. After some semi-risky blind movement, he makes sure to hit the loading trigger for Lava Tube, and then he roll jumps across this gap, and then punches over and comes to a standstill? Lava Tube skip is very esoteric, so let's break it down real quick by covering a more simple example that includes the same fundamental principles: Claw deload. This is a slower but consistent alternative to skipping Claw that you can easily perform yourself after watching this segment. First though, we need to cover the fundamentals of this trick and how it works. Whenever the game plays a spooled animation, aka any animation it has to load from the game disc, think the intro cutscenes, the power cell animations, talking to any NPC, it will create a backup of the current load state that, among other things, keeps track of your currently loaded levels. It will load this backup at the end of the spooled animation to put the game into the exact state it was in previously. Jak's idle animations that play after 30 seconds of inactivity happen to be spooled animations, meaning we can easily go through this routine on command. The difference here though is that these idle animations can be easily interrupted. In fact, it can be interrupted as early as the first frame thanks to this line of code that checks if certain buttons are being held down. If they are, it immediately puts us back into the default target stance state right as the idle animation begins. This will cause the game to load our previous backup before it has a chance to overwrite it with our current load state, and cause any levels that aren't in that backup to deload. This alone isn't all that useful, but there's a separate check that happens every frame that will change our checkpoint if it's from a different level than the one we are currently in. In casual gameplay, this occurs when entering a new level, like heading back to Sandover Village from Forbidden Jungle. But in this example, after interrupting the idle animation, our load state was updated from a backup, and our current level is now assigned to Sentinel Beach, leading to a mismatch with our Forbidden Jungle checkpoint. It decides which checkpoint to give you based on a distance check, choosing the one closest to Jak in your new current level, and this is how we are going to skip past Claw. To perform it yourself, first head over to the Claw boss fight and watch his intro cutscene. This will update our backup load state, then we can double back over towards Boggy Swamp, making sure not to die to the Lurker Shark. Once inside Boggy, head over to this rock, then start holding down the X button for 30 seconds. Once the animation starts, it will instantly cancel, and the game will load our current backup before it has a chance to update it. This will cause Boggy Swamp to deload and our current level to be set to Mountain Pass. It then finds our closest checkpoint to be the one right behind Claw, and once we die, we have successfully skipped the Claw boss fight. Runners nickname this tech an idle deload, although a deload isn't always a part of the outcome, and this is going to be fundamental to Lava Tube Skip. Back over to Stellar, he started standing still so he can get an idle animation to play, and he moved his camera over to make sure his new backup that is going to be created will have lava tubes set as his current level after the idle animation starts. After he sees the idle animation start to play, he doubles back over and quickly enters and exits first person mode, passing his camera through a trigger to change his level to Volcanic Crater, which will update his checkpoint and cause a mismatch later. Now with his checkpoint set, he has to bypass that lava tube trigger he hit before, so he can keep his current level and current checkpoint as Volcanic Crater. Since we already established that this trigger is camera based, he just needs to get his camera far enough out to avoid it, which he does by first carefully positioning it, then uppercutting out over the void to push it out just a little bit further. Now that he's physically inside of Lava Tube while the game still considers him to be in Volcanic Crater with a Volcanic Crater checkpoint, he needs to make it far enough in for his nearest Lava Tube checkpoint to be this midpoint one. This midway checkpoint will automatically spawn him onto the zoomer after dying, despite him not having enough cells to ride it from the start. This is where that extra health comes into play. Most of the ground in this level damages you with a burn event, but around some of the decorative rocks, pillars, and edges in the level, that collision wasn't given the damage event and can be walked across safely. These areas are nicknamed cold spots by runners and are spaced out just enough for us to barely be able to make it where we need to go. Stellar makes his way through this level as fast as possible via his mastery of spacing. He's memorized exactly where these cold spots are and how to move between them optimally. The final major roadblock for Lava Tube Skip is this big gap that we cannot damage boost across now that all of our reserve HP was used up. Luckily, this scout fly box is placed perfectly for our purposes. Stellar can walk off the side of this box to get a boosted uppercut, which, if timed correctly, can just barely make it to the last cold spot we need to reach. He uses a first-person zoom here to assist with this boosted, and delays his spin until the very last second to land on the cold spot and punch towards the edge of it and keep that button held for the idle deload. Because his backup state includes Lava Tube, unlike that alternative claw skip, the level won't visually deload, so he has to look for a more subtle indicator that the idle animation has been interrupted. Jak's feet will visibly twitch once this happens, as the game attempts to start the animation and instantly cancels it. Once Stellar sees that, he knows that his checkpoint has now changed, so he punches forward and dies, respawning on the zoomer, skipping the last 72 cell requirement. Right in front of this checkpoint is a machine that will unlock the door to the rest of the level, once all 5 of its balls are destroyed using yellow eco. The rest of this level is a very straightforward shot to the end. The only thing Stellar needs to pay attention to are his lines throughout the level and taking out any obstacles in the way with yellow eco. He collects the cell at the end to remove the last invisible wall that would block the entrance into Citadel, which is the final level of the game. To unlock the physical door to Citadel, he also needs to hit this button to activate the final portal connection and let Kira through. This normally starts a cutscene, but we can avoid it with a trick called a pause buffer. Pressing the pause button will instantly bring up the pause menu, but by hitting L2 or R2 to bring up the HUD and hitting the pause button on the same frame, we can delay the pause by 2.5 seconds while still being able to move until the HUD disappears and the pause menu comes back up. During this 2.5 second window, cutscenes will be unable to start, but we can still queue up certain ones to play, like the ones tied to having the portal button pressed. For this Kira cutscene, there's lava right next to the portal that can instantly kill us, and if we hit the button during the pause buffer and die, the cutscene will attempt to play once we unpause the game, but Jak will respawn and the cutscene will be skipped. A similar cutscene skip is about to take place at the start of Citadel, but with a more dramatic result. Once he's at the entrance to Citadel, Stellar readies another pause buffer and roll jumps into the level, and down into an endless pit so he can die. After he unpauses, he respawns all the way up at the very top of the level. You see, some cutscenes will update your current checkpoint, but on certain versions of the game, this checkpoint for the starting Citadel cutscene was incorrectly assigned to the end checkpoint of the level. This was later fixed in the NTSC v2 version of the game, but this error is still present on early NTSC copies and in other regions like PAL, which Stellar is currently playing on. In casual gameplay, this checkpoint normally gets changed back as soon as the player passes through this trigger while going to explore the rest of Citadel. But because this cutscene played after Stellar had already passed through this trigger, he gets to take advantage of this misassigned checkpoint and skip the entire level. Once at the top, he readies a HUD buffer to skip Citadel's final cutscene. This trick has the same principle as a pause buffer, but instead of hitting L2 or R2 and pause on the same frame, you hold L2 or R2 first, then press pause. The trade-off of which is a shorter actionable window before the game pauses, about a half a second after pressing the pause button. But for this skip, all he needs is to be able to open the menu after he collects the cell, rather than move a significant distance while a cutscene is queued to play. Once the cell hits the ground, the game autosaves and closes the task Citadel Sage Green, so when Stellar loads his file, he respawns and enters the elevator. The cutscene for freeing Samos was skipped entirely by doing this, because it normally plays after the cell animation is completed, which never played. Once the suspenseful elevator ride is over, he breaks a crate containing the blue eco needed to activate the platform over to the final boss, and about midway through the ride, he punches off and dies, hitting a checkpoint beforehand to respawn and make it over to the boss platform slightly faster, where he then starts the first phase of Final Boss. This fight is pretty simple, but at the end of the first 3 phases, there is a 1-frame trick that can save multiple seconds per phase, simply called a 1-frame. Whenever you jump on a blue eco-powered jump pad, on the 15th frame after you press X to initiate the jump, you can hit the circle button during the transition between the target duck high jump state and the verbosely named target duck high jump state, which will not only give you less height than a normal jump and let you reach the ground faster, they will also start the next phase faster. To go into the next phase of Final Boss, the game is checking for 2 things. 1, if the bomb the boss shot out has exploded, which happens when Jak gets to a certain height above it, and 2, if Jak no longer has the launch jump surface mod. The 1-frame spin gives Jak the needed height from the initial launch pad jump to explode the bomb, but removes the launch jump surface mod, fulfilling both requirements before Jak touches the ground. The timing to go for one of these 1-frame tricks is slightly later than a normal jump pad jump due to the lesser height given, so Stellar opts to not go for the first of the 3 as it saves the least amount of time and if failed could lose him a few seconds versus just jumping normally as early as possible. While the boss is setting up for the next phase, he grabs this green eco cluster. Before the eco fully despawns, he quickly enters and exits first person mode, which flings his camera far below the level while the game attempts to transition it back into the special state it's in during the fight. Down here, the camera is far enough away to end up outside of the tree assigned to the green eco, like during the first cell deload in Geyser, causing it to respawn once the camera comes back up, giving him an extra hit to work with, making the already easy fight much safer. This next phase simply involves killing the corrupted Lurker enemies with yellow eco as soon as they spawn, until the blue eco vent becomes active again after the 12th Lurker is killed. Stellar waits on the jump pad, watching the head of the robot for a visual cue to start a 1-frame. Once it shakes to the left, he manages to hit the trick and spam spin at the apex of the jump to stay high enough for the bomb to explode as soon as it lands in the middle of the arena, which makes the boss instantly transition into its next phase. And now he waits for the yellow eco to spawn again and fires at the boss. The damage threshold for this phase is super small, so he finishes it very quickly, and Stellar gets ready for the last 1-frame. With 2 out of 3 hit successfully, he's pretty much home free. Like every other phase, this final one is again very simple. This time he grabs 2 eco as the damage threshold is higher. He again spams shots at the boss, this time tanking a hit because he can afford to with that extra green eco. During the transition into the final cutscene, there's a quick shot of the boss roaring. Stellar jumps into the air to avoid it, as it doesn't take away control if you aren't grounded. With this extra bit of time, he positions himself at the end of the arena before the Light Eco cutscene plays. Once it's finished, the game will shoot out the last collectible that finishes the fight at a random location, so this position allows him to easily react to whichever location it decides to land. Here, he gets an average spawn, losing a tiny bit of time off of his best segment, and secures the world record with a 15:45. Once again, massive shoutouts to Stellar for this stellar run, and for helping me during this video's production, which, might have taken a little bit longer than anticipated. Speaking of helping out, massive shoutouts to Barg and the Open Goal team. Having the entire trilogy decompiled on PC is a dream come true. Before I start yapping about some personal stuff and where I've been, quick shout out to this channel's partner NordVPN. If you like what I do and are in the market for obscuring your browsing from your internet service provider and advertisers, enhancing your online security, or hopping to other countries to enjoy region-locked content and want to support me in the process, consider using my link in the description below. No pressure, of course. If you want to support me in a more direct way, you can also join my paid supporters on either Patreon, Twitch, or right here on YouTube. Big shoutouts to Mortis, to Breeze Sadiq, Yoinkaroon, Adam, Symphony, Rubix, That One Lombax, Space J76, Low Normandy, Bargo34, Cremosi25, and Bintendo42. So, regarding where I've been, I've kind of been side questing since the gunless video. I've worked on a few projects that I ended up shelving for later because I felt like they weren't up to my standards, which made me a very annoying perfectionist while working on this one. After a while of not being able to consistently work on the project, I set my sights for AGDQ 2026, and started really pushing for Jak and Daxter to get in, with Nintendo and the rest of the community pulling together a ton of submissions. To help secure the funds to go to the event, I decided to compete in the challenges hosted by Speedrun.com, and placed third on the very last run that had time to finish before the submission deadline in the first challenge I participated in. I enjoyed the game so much that I ended up including it into my submissions for AGDQ, and to my utter shock, both my race with Nintendo in Jak 3 No Out of Bounds, and the SRC challenge game Jet Runner got into the event. I later also got third in the Shinobi Dark Katana challenge, which completely funded my trip up to Pittsburgh, where I had one of the best weeks of my life with the PlayStation Nation. It took a while for the bittersweet feelings of the week ending to subside, but eventually I got the drive to work on the channel again thanks to some great books I read and some very encouraging talks with friends. And I hope I can keep that momentum going for the foreseeable future. But for now, that's all I got to report. Thank you so much for making it to the end. I hope to see you again sometime, and I hope that life treats you to something nice soon. Later, y'all.